Vulnerability assessment. This is some extra material for UCLA 420.2. It covers class 5. The reason why I'm giving you these slides is because neither the text nor the NIST document really, I think, covers this topic sufficiently for your purposes. You can't really conduct a thorough vulnerability assessment based on what those documents have. The NIST document is a bit better, but we'll get into these in a little bit here. Now, the textbook summary. Basically, what does the textbook say about vulnerabilities? It provides you a definition, a weakness or environmental factors that increase the probability or likelihood of a threat being successful. So it's something that makes it more likely that a threat agent could carry out their nefarious deed. They call for the creation of organization-wide vulnerability catalog, a catalog or central listing of all vulnerabilities, both verified current vulnerabilities as well as hypothetical or potential vulnerabilities. And they say you can base this list on the assessor's experience, documents or assessments already in place, or comprehensive lists, which means you pull a list out of some place, not the textbook, of course, they don't have that list, but someplace will have these lists that you can use to describe vulnerabilities. In short, you don't get much guidance from the text in determining which vulnerabilities apply to the assessment scope. If you're actually using the text to conduct a vulnerability assessment, or rather a risk assessment, the area where you're dealing with vulnerabilities will be a little bit weak here. Now let's look at NIST SP 830. It's got a definition, which is a vulnerability is a weakness in an information system, procedures, internal controls, or implementation that could be exploited by a threat source. So rather than just saying increase the probability, it says could be exploited, but it's close enough. This is a pretty common definition, so it's a variation on what the text says. Now, vulnerabilities, according to this, may be found in information systems, organizational governance structure, external relations, vendors, customers, other third parties, business processes, how you do things, and IT architecture, which isn't just the specific facts of a system, but is the overall design and guiding principles of your environment. Now, an important thing about the NIST document is in addition to vulnerabilities, they also define predisposing conditions. A vulnerability is a weakness. A predisposing condition is just a fact about your organization, its processes, that affects whether or not a particular threat is relevant or whether or not a particular vulnerability is relevant to your organization. So a vulnerability is a weakness. A predisposing condition is just a fact about your environment. Sources of vulnerability information can be either internal or external to an organization. Internal sources include risk reports, stuff that's already been done that looks at the risks of various systems, reports that have been done, say, by your predecessor or that you yourself have done previously. Incident reports. A lot of times you'll have incidents logs, security incidents, things like potential hacking attack, malware found, stolen laptop, something of that sort. And the historical record of security incidents is very helpful in finding vulnerabilities because repeated incidents may indicate certain things you need to be concerned about. Results of various sorts of monitoring will also give you information. And in trouble tickets, sometimes people will report issues with systems that are indicative of a security issue, a password logout, strange behavior that turns out to be some sort of malware. That's the sort of thing that you may find by looking through trouble tickets. Now, external sources of information include sector or industry-based associations like the ISACs, as well as research organizations, both nonprofit as well as vendor-provided research. The scope of a vulnerability in the NIST system reflects the organizational level to which it applies. So when you're following the NIST guidelines or framework, keep in mind what level of the organization a specific vulnerability applies to. It can apply to multiple, but typically it applies to one and not others. Pervasive across the organization, you've got a vulnerability that applies because of the nature of the organization or because of some sort of global fact about the organization that relates to that vulnerability. A tier 2 is scoped to a process, architecture, or common infrastructure, meaning the vulnerability is common to a set of related processes or infrastructure items. And in a Tier 3 vulnerability is specific to a given system. It exists in that system and doesn't necessarily apply to other systems. Here's the diagram that NIST provides to help you understand these tiers. And what you want to do is align a vulnerability to a specific tier when you are categorizing vulnerabilities and creating your vulnerability catalog. Now, Appendix F from the NIST summary provides inputs to vulnerability identification. It gives you a taxonomy or a way to categorize and organize and describe vulnerabilities. It gives you a method to assess the severity of vulnerabilities. And then it provides you templates for documenting the vulnerabilities. So the first 3 bullet points here, the first 3 red bullet points are guidance to do things. And then the last one is how to do it, how to insert or describe the vulnerability in your risk document. These are all used in NIST Task 2.3 in their methodology. You see here we've got Step 2, and in 2.3 is identify vulnerabilities and predisposing conditions. Yes, I know this looks like it should be 2.2, but it really is 2.3 because you can see I lifted the summary of key activities in 2.3 from the NIST document. It's identify the vulnerabilities using various sorts of input, assess the severity, identify predisposing conditions, and then update your documents for the risk, for adversarial versus non-adversarial. Again, a good thing about NIST is if you've got an intelligent adversary, they use a slight variation on determining the risk as opposed to something that's either an accident or an act of nature. You have a risk of flooding, fire, or somebody accidentally doing something they didn't intend, and the risk there is dealt with differently than somebody who's actively trying to compromise your organization. Now, the NIST SP 830 document doesn't give a lot of detail on finding vulnerabilities. There's a companion document, the Technical Guide to Information Security Testing and Assessment. It's really good. It's really focused. It's more for vulnerability assessments that deal with systems and networks. And it emphasizes the more technical assessment approaches. It provides assessment details or process for conducting assessments that are missing from NIST SP 830. Again, keep in mind this is a technical guideline document. And I will mention that I'm discussing this in the class, but it's not something that you feel like you have to go out and read. Certainly be aware it exists and what it does, but it's not something that in 420.2 is going to be a major part of what you're expected to learn here. Now, SP 800-115 describes the following methods for finding vulnerabilities. Documentation review, review reports, review documentation about your systems, review logs for events that may indicate vulnerabilities in the system, look at rule sets like firewall rules to determine if there are holes or gaps in these rules, perform system configuration reviews, do a self-configuration audit, say, of servers and desktop machines and see what needs to be done there. Sniff the network, both to determine if everything can be accounted for, if there's any malicious traffic, as well as determining if there's vulnerable services, if devices are properly separated on their own network segments, etc. If you're sniffing, say, a network management subnet or VLAN and you find voice over IP traffic, that may not be a good thing, and that may be a finding. And in file integrity checking, both determining if you've got unusual unaccounted for files in your system by looking at the hashes of those files, as well as determining whether known files have been modified in an unauthorized fashion. Even if it's just a matter of somebody bypassing change control, modification to the system that isn't properly documented is a very bad thing. And in here, again, borrowed from the NIST document, is a little more review of some of these techniques. Look at your policies and procedures under documentation review. Log reviews can review policy deviations. You want to look at historical use, configuration, and modification. Rule set reviews, holes and security controls. Configuration reviews, make sure that systems are configured in accordance with the hardening policy. Network sniffing, verify the encryption of communication. That's very important here. If you're supposed to be talking to an internal server using SSL, make sure it doesn't fall back to unencrypted HTTP. And then file integrity checking. Now, finding vulnerabilities, and here I'm going to tell you a bit about some of the stuff from my experience, involves the following methods. Audits, which you take a checklist of standards for good security and you review the evidence in the organization that those standards are followed. Scanning, which can involve either scanning a network or a subnet for devices to determine if they have security flaws, or performing a detailed examination of a website for the same purpose. Configuration reviews, which is looking at the internal configuration of systems and devices to see if they match good security standards. And finally, something called a penetration test, which is actually an act like a hacker and see if you can break in type of assessment. Now, audits involve reviewing compliance with security standards. You take the standards, you make them concrete in a sense that they refer to or can be verified through facts that can be determined through examination, and then you see whether the actual facts match the standard. It can include non-technical vulnerabilities. You can do an audit of physical security. You can look at the process for issuing and managing card key access. You can see if doors are propped open. You can ensure that the proper locks are in place on all secure facilities, etc. A lot of audits can be done just by walking around, for example. Operation security are proper processes followed, and personnel security involves both the vetting of employees, things like background checks and so forth for sensitive positions, as well as ongoing training and human resource type activity to ensure that folks, once they're hired, follow the rules. Audits can involve reviewing documentation. What are your policies and procedures? They can involve interviews with folks. What policies are you aware of? Policy X. Tell me how you perform procedure Y. And then you can look at the business transaction system that record activities to make sure that those records actually match what the policies in interviews say. You compare findings to standards, note the differences, and where there is a discrepancy, there may be a risk that needs to be reported. Now, scanning. Network scanning is you perform an overview of network services available on some portion of your network, maybe even the entire network. You zip through a bunch of possible IP addresses, you find which ones are responding, and then the ones that respond, you say, okay, do you have any open network services? Okay, you've got this service. Give me some more information so I can guess what version you're running. And then you see if there are unauthorized or vulnerable services. Is there a file share somewhere where it's not supposed to be? Is somebody using a really old version of a web server when that version is very vulnerable? Software that's used for network scanning is Nmap and Nessus. Nmap is open source and completely free. It's an excellent scanning tool. Nessus is a product that once upon a time was open and free. You can use it for free strictly for personal purposes. In an enterprise version, you have to pay a bit of money, a few hundred a year for a license. The licensed version obviously gets you a lot more functionality in addition to keeping you out of trouble with the Nessus licensing folks. Now, website scanning is you go to a website, you spider it, you look at all the elements, you insert input, you change things like cookies, you change HTTP response headers, and you look at these things and you see, can I make this thing fail? Can I make a security flaw happen here? If I enter a apostrophe semicolon in a field, will it give me a database error, meaning there's SQL injection? That's what website scanning does, is it goes through all the possible combinations of input to a website that the scanning tool can do and says, can I make something here fail in a way that indicates a security problem? Examples of the software are the commercial product IBM's AppScan, the Zap proxy, which is a free scanning tool available from OWASP, and then the Burp Suite, which, similar to Nessus, has both a limited functionality free version and an enterprise version that's available for a very reasonable licensing fee per year. Now, configuration review. This can involve server self-audits. You log into a server, you can either manually dump information about the server, you can like bring up the local security policy of a standalone Windows server and see if it matches the standards of your organization and good practices, or you can run some software that performs a self-audit. The Center for Internet Security, CISecurity.org, is a website. It's actually an organization that runs this website that provides a lot of security benchmarks for many, many types of systems, devices, and so forth. It's the go-to place for security audits or reviews for configuration of devices. There are also a lot of tools, both open source and vendor provided, that can be used to conduct configuration reviews. CI Security has some tools, but most of what they've got there is of the form of documents, Adobe Acrobat documents, Excel spreadsheets that provide whole lists of secure configuration standards. You can also, if you have central configuration management, and if your organization is of any decent size, you've got to have this. You can go to that configuration management system and say, give me a report of all the servers in the system and what patch level of this, that, and that they have. Give me all the mail servers and what version of Microsoft Exchange and what's the latest patch applied. And that will help you with the configuration review as well. It'll allow you to do multiple servers at once. You're leveraging a tool used by your server admins to make their life manageable in order to help improve security. Now, penetration tests. These are detailed act like a hacker attempts to breach security. The general approach in a penetration test is the pen tester scans the network, finds out what's on it, tries to find vulnerabilities in any devices, and then tries to exploit the vulnerabilities, actually tries to get in. And this can be dangerous because exploitation sometimes will cause servers to crash or things not to function properly. So you need to be very careful about doing this sort of a test. And then once they exploit a system, they use that system to hop off into other systems, to exploit trust relations between the system they just hacked, to find other more valuable systems. They might find a password file in that system, they pull it down and crack it, etc. So it's this whole chain. If you try to break in the front door, you get into the next door, and then finally you get the most valuable stuff in the system. You document the results, and then you show in a detailed report how an attacker could feasibly gain access to valuable resources. It's a very deep and very narrow sort of assessment. It's very real in a sense that we're not just dealing with compliance and does this match a standard. We're dealing with, hey, if somebody got to the front door, they could actually get all the way in using this method. The actual exploitation makes this a penetration test. Actively exploiting devices is the difference between a pen test and a vulnerability scan. Don't let anyone tell you that running Nessus is a penetration test. It's not. Now, when we're dealing with vulnerabilities, there are some standards here that are widely accepted. And the first one is the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposure, or CVE. This is a designator, a primary key, if you will, of the vulnerability. It's just the common cross-reference or index of every vulnerability that's been published in the last many years. It's an encyclopedia of publicly known security vulnerabilities. It's maintained by the MITRE Corporation with funding from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. It assigns each vulnerability a unique designator and cross-references to other sources. There may be multiple entities. Maybe a vendor reports a flaw in their software. Maybe some independent security research organization also finds that flaw as well. The point of the CVE is it will point you to all of those primary sources, and it consolidates them for the same vulnerability. It's a common standard for specifying vulnerabilities. And in here we have an example of a CVE. This one was released in February of 2016, last revised on that date. The overview is it's a problem with Adobe Flash Player with certain versions on both Windows and Macintosh, as well as Adobe Air Software Development Kit. And then the kicker is allows attackers to execute arbitrary code by leveraging an unspecified type confusion. Type confusion is a type of software flaw, and in this case, if an attacker can get to the application, they can execute code of their choosing, which is really not good. It cross-references to the common vulnerability. You've got here, and we'll talk about this in another slide, the CVSS, which is the severity ranking. There's both a version 2 and a version 3. You've got for the severity ranking the overall base score. 8.8 means it's high. You've got the components that make up that score. And then you've got a description overall of this vulnerability. It's accessible through the network. The complexity to exploit is low. You don't need privileges to exploit. You do apparently need some user interaction. And then you've got your standard disclaimer here. You're going away from the NIST site, going to other sites. And this is the primary link to that vulnerability from Adobe. So what we've got here is we've got the CVE, And then we've got the Adobe presentation of this. And what we've got on this slide here is a standardized format of information about this. And this is something that's extremely valuable when you're compiling vulnerabilities. Now, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, CVSS, was mentioned on that prior slide for that particular CVE. It's a scoring tool for IT vulnerabilities. It answers the question, how bad is it? You know, when you tell your management, particularly non-technical management, we just found a security vulnerability, or a vulnerability has been announced in some software we use all across our organization, the first thing they'll say is, how bad is this? And what this gives you is a credible justification and a common accepted methodology for measuring badness of a vulnerability. The CVSS is owned and managed by First.org Inc., and First.org is a consortium of computer emergency response teams within the United States. So it's a grouping of groups that respond to incidents. And the score is based on the following. You have the base score, which is what's inherent in the vulnerability as it's announced, and this won't change much. You have a temporal score, which varies across the life cycle of the vulnerability. You know, vulnerability may start out with, well, this, we know it exists, but we haven't seen any proof it can be exploited. And then, oh, somebody found proof it can be exploited. And now, oh no, we're seeing bad guys out in the wild actively exploiting this. And then it's, oh good, the vendor has released a patch. That whole cycle of concept, potential exploitability, active exploitability, remediation affects the temporal score. Where you are in this life cycle, it can be either worse or less worse, depending. And then there's what's called a modified score or an environmental score. And this is for your organization, the specific unique things about your organization that may make this vulnerability better or worse. You may be an organization that bans Adobe Flash. So a Flash-based exploit should be less of an issue for you than an organization that mandates Adobe Flash as a common element for all desktop and laptop machines. If you banish it, then it's only an unauthorized user that would be vulnerable. If it's installed everywhere, then any user could possibly be vulnerable. So that's a CVSS. Now, you've got your list of vulnerabilities. You know, you have some awareness of what it might take to remediate them. You know how bad they are. You know what systems are vulnerable. And you're assessing the risk here across your environment. You're not just doing a single risk assessment. You're doing this for everything. You need something called vulnerability management. You need to keep track of this stuff. You need to manage it. You need to report metrics to your management to make sure that they understand that you're making progress in securing the organization. And you need something to make order out of this chaos. Vulnerability management is a cyclical practice of identifying, classifying, remediating, and mitigating vulnerabilities, and that's from Wikipedia. An organization's information technology risk management program must incorporate vulnerability management. Vulnerability management is not optional. It has to be a part of your risk management program if you've got such a program. And of course, there are vendors have products to sell to support vulnerability management. And they'll say, buy our vulnerability management product, implement it, and you will have vulnerability management. And of course, nothing is that simple, and no vendor product cures everything. And I will certainly not recommend any products here, but you should be aware they exist and that people will try to sell them to you. Now, here's the processes involved in vulnerability. You find, evaluate, and record vulnerabilities in your system as you perform different assessments, audits, scans, penetration tests, etc. You determine the risk of the vulnerability and the cost to remediate. You determine what specific action may be required to remediate. Is it a process change? Is it a patch applied to commercial software? Is it a custom modification to in-house software? Do we have to add a firewall rule? Do we have to add an intrusion prevention rule, etc.? You want to track the remediation efforts throughout their entire life cycle. And once a remediation effort has been completed, you need to go back and verify it, because oftentimes well-intentioned technical folks will do something that they believe fixes a problem that doesn't really in fact fix it very well. So there's always a need to verify remediation. You want to rescan, you want to re-audit, etc. And then to provide proof that you're doing this and making progress, you want to provide metrics to management on your remediation efforts. So your remediation The prioritization is based on criticality. You perform a quicker remediation for more severe vulnerabilities. The worse it is, the quicker you need to fix it, because time costs money, and doing something quickly induces other risks. A very high-risk security vulnerability may be worth it. A security vulnerability that isn't very high risk, you may want to follow standard processes and do your full-on QA and so forth, and not necessarily budget extra funds because it's included as part of ongoing operations. You want to consider leveraging existing change management processes and priorities for your vulnerability remediation priorities. You probably already have a change management process that includes emergency changes, high priority changes, and low priority changes, defines timeframes, defines management sign-off responsibility, defines how these changes get tested and vetted. And you may want to consider adopting those for security remediation. You certainly don't want to give your management teams a completely different set of priority and processes than the ones they use for all their other problems and issues. Now, some examples of metrics, management reporting on the vulnerability management process. You can, for example, summarize number of vulnerabilities found by criticality, and perhaps note by criticality by system, by business process, by architecture, etc. You can break this down further. Number of vulnerabilities remediated, and you may do this by time period. How many were remediated this quarter versus the prior quarter versus the prior quarter? What's the pace of remediation? How many critical have been remediated versus high versus medium? Time from vulnerability discovery to remediation is very important. This is your window of vulnerability. You want to tighten this up, and you want to make it very small for critical vulnerabilities. And then lastly, of course, management loves to know how much things cost. So you should keep track of man hours, vendor provided services, hardware and software, etc., that it takes to remediate, because you will need to budget for this stuff. And ultimately, what you want to do is make an argument that stuff should be secured in the first place, rather than just throwing it in production and waiting for security to scan it. You want to be able to point to the costs of remediation as saying, now see, if you guys didn't stand up software that had flaws in it to begin with, you would save this sort of cost. And that, in a nutshell, is vulnerability management, and that, in a nutshell, is the stuff about vulnerabilities that the textbook doesn't really deal with.